Hi guys, and welcome back to Chapter 8. Now, previously we gave an introduction to what biodiversity is, and then we followed that up with what are the benefits of biodiversity to us specifically. Now that we've talked about that, in Lecture 3 we're going to be going over biodiversity loss. Now, before we get into the specifics of biodiversity loss, it would be really helpful to go over a few common terms and definitions. First and foremost is extinction. Extinction occurs when the last individual of a species globally dies out. And for at least the immediate future, extinction appears to be permanent, meaning that once a species goes extinct, it is wiped out and gone forever. It's also important to note that extinction is a natural process. In fact, 99% of all species that have ever existed on Earth have gone extinct. There's also a useful term called the background extinction rate. Because extinction is a natural process, an average number of species go extinct every single year just under natural conditions. For example, for mammal and marine species, around one species goes extinct every year out of the millions that exist in each taxonomic group. There's also something useful to note, which is called extirpation, and this is referred to sort of as a local extinction. This is the disappearance of a species from a given area, but not the disappearance of a species from the entire globe. So again, extirpation is sort of a localized extinction. It is the loss of a species in an area, but not the loss of a species, period, throughout the globe. And there's also something called a mass extinction. A mass extinction is defined as an extinction level event where more than 50% of all species go extinct all at once. Now, Earth has undergone 5 mass extinction events over the last 440 million years. Now, we say in the past that Earth has undergone 5 mass extinction level events in the past, but a lot of evidence suggests that we are actually driving a 6th mass extinction. And this is because humans have caused hundreds of species to go extinct within the last few centuries alone. Now, the global extinction rate is currently 100 to 1,000 times greater than that background extinction event, that historical average that we talked about previously. And these rates of extinctions have been increasing as human population and resource use continues to grow. And there are several major causes of biodiversity loss: habitat loss, pollution, overharvesting, invasive species introductions, and of course climate change, all of which we are going to be going over in the next few slides of this lecture. But before we get into the drivers of habitat loss, we should go over something called the Living Planet Index. This is an index that expresses how large the average population size of a species is now compared to its size back in 1970 when the index was first developed. And between 1970 and 2012, we have seen the living index fall by almost 60%. That is a staggering loss of species, meaning that on average a given species population has been reduced in number by almost 60%. That is more than half. But it should be noted that freshwater species, and particularly amphibians, are really the worst off here. And that is because amphibians, because they breathe through their skin and absorb water through their skin, they are particularly susceptible to water pollution. And as a result, amphibians are being wiped off the map faster than any other taxon or any other living group of animals on the planet. Now, the first source of biodiversity loss comes from habitat loss. And this should be noted that habitat loss is the single greatest cause of biodiversity loss globally. And this is because species are often specifically adapted to their habitats because they've evolved there for millions of years. As a result, the loss of a habitat often results in the loss of one or more endemic species. Those are those specialists that we talked about in Chapter 4 that had adapted to very specific habitat conditions. Now, habitat fragmentation is a very specific form of habitat loss that is commonly seen across ecosystems around the world. This is the type of habitat loss that occurs via very gradual, piecemeal degradation. Essentially, this is where we carve through unbroken expanses of habitat, such as grasslands or forests or any other type of ecosystem, and break up that large continuous habitat into smaller, discontinuous habitat patches. Now, these individual habitat patches are far more susceptible to disturbance, meaning that the diminished size of the habitat increases the probability that that habitat will be completely wiped out, or that patch of habitat will be completely wiped out due to any one given disturbance event. And this is due to reasons such as different habitat patches have diminished access to their seed repositories, meaning it's much harder for vegetation to regenerate after disturbance, and habitat fragmentation also blocks animal movement between patches, usually because we put roads or some sort of human construct in between the two habitat patches. So as a result, both top-down and bottom-up ecosystem controls are lost as a result of habitat fragmentation. Now, examples of practices which cause habitat fragmentation include things such as farming, logging, roads, or suburban development. Any time that we kind of carve into a habitat and break it up from that very large continuous structure into something that is far more patchy and far more discontinuous. Now, the next form of biodiversity loss that we're going to talk about is pollution. Pollution is broadly defined as the presence or introduction of a substance or energy source into the environment that has detrimental effects on natural ecosystems. And this is because it either kills or adversely affects the plants and animals that are exposed to this substance or energy source. Now, the broad types of pollution are substance pollution and energy pollution. Substance pollution refers to different substances that when added to the environment have adverse effects to that ecosystem. And these can be things like toxins, pesticides, heavy metals, pharmaceutical wastes, or fossil fuel emissions. They can be things such as excess nutrients, things like fertilizer or sediment inputs that we've already talked about as a result of agricultural pollution. Or they can be things like trash, things like plastics that once introduced into an environment, organisms can choke and die on because they think they're food. Now, the other side of pollution that most people don't really know about or talk about are things such as energy pollution. And this can be things like light pollution, noise pollution, as well as thermal pollution or heat pollution, all of which can adversely affect different organisms in different ecosystems that either kill or adversely affect these organisms. Now, overharvesting is a form of biodiversity loss that happens when the harvesting of individuals of a species occurs at rates that exceed the capacity of that species to replenish its own numbers. Basically, this is any time that the harvest rate is greater than the reproduction rate of a given species. Now, in many cases, this is referred to as poaching, or the unlawful killing of animals for meat and or body parts. And this is because governments have identified certain animals at which are being harvested faster than they can replenish their own numbers, and have therefore outlawed any harvesting of that organism as an effort to get that organism's population numbers up. At critical risk are large, long-lived animals, and this is because larger animals typically have very long lifespans and very slow reproduction rates. These are things like elephants, rhinoceroses, or any apex predators. Usually, again, these are going to be organisms that live a very long time and reproduce very slowly. So if we harvest them too quickly, they can be very susceptible to extinction via overharvesting. Now, invasive species is a more recent form of biodiversity loss, and this is something we've already talked about a little bit in depth in earlier chapters, but this is the introduction of non-native species into a new environment. It's important to note that actually most invasions from different species fail. In fact, 95% of introductions of different invasive species fail simply because the environment is not suitable for that species to thrive in. Now, in the rare instances where species can survive and in these new environments, they often spread and reproduce uncontrollably. And there are several reasons for this. Usually when an organism evolves in a given environment, other organisms evolve and co-evolve with it. And so that organism evolves in the presence of predators, in the presence of different pathogens that know how to eat and break it down, as well as different competitors within that native ecosystem that know how to compete against that species. But when that species is introduced into a non-native environment, all of these controlling factors are gone. There are no predators that know how to eat this invasive species. No pathogens are there that have evolved to eat it or break it down, and there are no competitors in this new native environment that know how to compete against the species. And so as a result, from the lack of predation, the lack of competition, and the lack of pathogens and disease, these invasive species often spread uncontrollably. It also doesn't help that most of these invasive species happen to be fast-growing, prolific breeding species, sometimes known as weedy species. And because these invasive species can reproduce so quickly, they often completely outcompete the natives and also alter the habitat so that natives can no longer live there, period, whether the invasive species exist there or not. They also use up a lot of valuable resources, and as a result, once an invasive species has been allowed to run rampant through a native ecosystem, it can completely cause that ecosystem to collapse. The final form of biodiversity loss that we're going to talk about today is climate change. Now, climate change is the observed change in global or regional climate patterns. In particular, the change in the apparent temperature from the mid to late 20th century onwards. And this has largely been attributed to the increased levels of atmospheric CO2 or carbon dioxide produced by fossil fuels. And what this does is that because CO2 is a greenhouse gas, meaning that because CO2 traps heat into the earth, it causes the earth to heat up gradually as more CO2 is emitted into the atmosphere. Now, this is something we're going to talk about at length in its own chapter, dubbed accordingly climate change, but we're going to go into it a little bit further here simply because it is such a significant contributor to biodiversity loss. Basically, climate change increases the temperature of the entire globe, but it also increases the frequency of extreme weather events. Because of this, and particularly because of the increase in temperature, it causes shifts in habitat ranges. And indirectly, climate change contributes to habitat loss because it makes certain natural habitats, even though they haven't been directly impacted by humans, it makes these habitats uninhabitable. And this is specifically due to the fact that certain species have adapted naturally to colder temperatures. Certain species around the globe have adapted to very cold temperatures, either being in very high latitudes, meaning being in the polar regions of the planet, or in very high altitudes, meaning that they are in very high up mountain climates. Now, because climate change warms the actual habitats, these organisms are seeing their ranges shift, meaning that organisms that live in the polar regions are seeing their ranges contract to higher and higher latitudes. And organisms that live in very high mountain regions are seeing their ranges shift higher and higher up the mountain. Eventually, there will be no place for them to go, and they will be forced to go extinct. Now, biodiversity loss is a really big deal, and this is because of the loss of many of the ecosystem services that we talked about specifically in the benefits of biodiversity lecture in this chapter earlier. And this can lead to severe impacts, both in economic losses, health impacts, and social disruption as we begin to see losses in these provisional, regulating, and supporting ecosystem services. Now, that is all we have today. I hope you've enjoyed this section on biodiversity loss. I know it can be a little bit depressing, but bear with me. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about some of the solutions to biodiversity loss, basically the introduction to conservation biology. I'll see you guys next time.